Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. A few days ago I made a pretty exciting video showing off Linux running on the Odin 2, which is primarily an Android-based handheld, but being able to run Linux opens up a bunch of other systems that you can play on it. And one of the many systems that I tested in that video was PlayStation 3, and if you remember at the time I said that I wanted to go a little bit deeper into it. And that's what I've been doing over the past few days. I've gone through and tested dozens of different games, and I want to show the results off for you here today. Now PS3 emulation is still very early on this chipset, and so I do expect it to improve in the future, but it's always nice to just get a state of how things are right now, and I think you might find some of these results pretty exciting. The additional power of the Odin 2's processor really does open up quite a bit more games than you may expect. Now, not many of them are going to run perfectly, but the ones that do are really impressive. Either way, this should be a pretty low-key video, so grab your favorite snack and drink, and let's go ahead and dive in. Now to start, I want to mention there are other ways to play PS3 games on a device like the Odin 2, but many of them require workarounds or are very early in their development. A couple weeks ago, an Android-based version of the PS3 emulator dropped, but it was super early and also a little bit sketchy as well because the developer at the time was using open source backing, but then was making it closed source and then also said that with enough donations, they would also make theirs open source. So kind of holding it hostage, which was really weird. And as you can expect, it got a lot of pushback from the community, and then it disappeared a couple days after that. Things got a little bit more heated a couple days later when one of the original developers of RPCS3, which is the PS3 emulator most people use, he actually developed and showed a proof of concept of an Android port of their emulator. Now, as far as I can tell, this one cannot actually play games just yet, but it was a proof of concept to show that it could work. And there may be other ways to use PS3 emulation on Android. For example, if you had WinLater, which is a Windows package within Android, and then through that layer, you actually installed RPCS3 and then tried to play it through that. I'm not sure how well it would go, but that is another option. For my part, I think that running ROCKNIX, which is a Linux-based operating system that boots from the SD card, is a more elegant solution because it can run the desktop version of RPCS3 because they have an ARM-based Linux version of it. And so that's the version that we'll be testing here today, and I think there is still room for improvement, including drivers as well as optimizations for the emulator itself. Now, this is not going to be a full-on guide because I think the development on this is still very early, but I do want to show you some tips and tricks and also some of the work involved because, like I mentioned, it took me several days of work to actually get this up and running. And the first thing to keep in mind is that within the Tools section, there is an option to start RPCS3, so you can boot directly into the desktop app. And that's essentially going to show you a very small window that has the desktop version working, as you can see here. So if you've ever set up PS3 before on a desktop environment, it's going to be almost identical. The only big issue here is the text is super small, so it is a pain to navigate. Personally, I've just been using a USB mouse like this connected to an OTG adapter. And so what I can do here is just plug this in, and then I can use this to actually navigate through the file system. Now, adding each of these games does take quite some time. You have to add them directly through the desktop interface and then also add an additional file to them so that they'll show up within Emulation Station. On top of that, once you've added the game, you'll have to cache all of its shaders and then also run the game a few times to get through all of the bugs so it stops crashing. And altogether, I tested over 50 games, and as you can imagine, with an hour per game, this is why it took me several days to get to where we are. Now, to load up each of your games, I would recommend going to the ROCKNIX wiki page. This will walk you through how to install the firmware, but then also how to load up each game and to make them readable by Emulation Station. From there, another thing I did is I went into the RPCS3 compatibility page. Here you can search for every game and then actually see whether or not it has specific configurations per game. And so for all 50 plus games that I tested, I went through and changed all the configurations to what they recommend. Another thing I did is I went into the gamepad settings and I changed the stick multiplier to 1.5. That allows me to have a little bit more range of motion. I found that before that, I wasn't getting a full range, and even then, it still seems a little bit wonky. Either way, if you are having issues where you're not getting full control, I would recommend messing around with these settings right here. Another thing within ROCKNIX you can do for each of these games is you can actually make per game configurations. So for example, here with Lumines, I can press the X button to bring up this menu and then go into advanced game options. And within here, you can make per game configurations. And the two that I changed the most were the internal PS3 resolution and the internal resolution scale. By default, I kept these at native, which is going to be 720p for most games, and then the internal resolution scale to 100%. However, if you run into any performance issues, these are the things that you can modify. So for example, I can drop it down to 576p or even 480p. To go even further, you can drop down the internal resolution scale down to 75%, 50, or even 25. I recommend not really going past 75 because things will get very janky at that point. For example, it makes the text extremely blurry past 75, and so in general, I try to keep it at 100% if possible. And so that's a quick rundown of some of the configuration tweaks that I would recommend if you are going to try this out. But now that we've gone over that stuff, let's actually talk about the gameplay performance. And I broke this off into 3 chunks. The first chunk is going to be PSN titles. These are more lightweight, downloadable titles that you can get from the PSN store. So these in general will run pretty well. There are also some games that are kind of in the middle, and these are more like remakes. So for example, remastered versions of older systems or PS2 in particular. And so some of these games I also tested out as well. And then finally, I also tested a bunch of full retail disc games. These are going to be much larger in size, usually 10 gigabytes or higher. And these are going to be like full $60 retail releases that came out back in the day. And these games in particular took a long time to test just because of the overall file size and the amount of caching that has to be done for each of them. And so I tested as many as I could, but there was a moment where I just had to cut it off and I said, okay, that is enough. I think that people are going to get a good idea at this point. So let's go ahead and start with those PSN titles. And for the most part, these actually run really well. Every once in a while, you'll have a game that just full on crashes and won't boot, but I would say the vast majority of them actually play pretty well. Before testing any of these games, I would recommend checking out that compatibility list on RPCS3 because it'll tell you right then and there whether or not the game is playable. And as you can imagine, if a game doesn't run well on PC, it's not going to run well on this device either. We are having a lot less power to work with than a full-on desktop computer. But there are a ton of great PSN titles that you'll be able to play. One of my favorites is Outrun Online Arcade. Another favorite of mine is Afterburner Climax, which runs pretty well at a native resolution, not quite at a full 60 frames per second all the time, but I would still consider it to be playable. And I would say among all the different library titles that I tested in this whole setup, these were probably the ones that performed the best. So in particular, if you are interested in trying out ROCKNIX, and PS3 is one of the big draws for you, and you mostly want to focus on PSN titles, then I think that yes, this is probably going to be worth the time investment. For the most part, I would say these games at a native resolution played really well. Not perfectly, I would not expect a full 60 frames per second every time, especially when shaders are caching. But other than that, I would say it's still very playable. And there were a lot of awesome PSN titles back in the day that aren't really available anywhere else, and so this might be a great way to unlock them. So long story short, if you are interested in putting ROCKNIX on your Odin 2 device, then I think that these PSN titles right here are definitely worth trying out. Now next up we have remade versions of some older games, and there were a lot of these titles on PSN, and I found that many of these work really well too. For example, Final Fight Double Impact worked really well, and same thing with Daytona USA. This one I've heard is many people's favorite version of this game, and yeah, it works really well. Not quite at a full 60 frames per second all the time, but still very, very playable. Another upscaled classic game that was available on PSN was Nights into Dreams, and this one runs really well too, and is super sharp and crisp. Now when it comes to upscaled PS2 versions that were available on PSN, we get a little bit more hit and miss performance, but some are very good. And a lot of these titles that were available as HD remakes are actually some of the ones that work the worst on the PS2 emulator, and so this might be a good workaround. For example, Beyond Good and Evil works really well, and it's in full widescreen, so I think it looks awesome. However, God of War 2 HD, even with a downscaled resolution, didn't play at full speed, so this is one where you're just better off playing the PS2 version, even though it can get buggy from time to time. Other games like Shadow of the Colossus are not quite at full speed, and this game gets really demanding as you start getting to the later levels, and so I would expect that the PS2 version is going to run better than this one as well. And sadly, there are also quite a few PS2 games that just crashed every time I tried to play them. So, for example, Ico would play some of the opening cinematic scenes, but the actual gameplay would crash the machine. Same thing with the Jak and Daxter and Sly Cooper games. So unfortunately, I was hoping to really play those HD remasters, but I don't think it's in the cards at least right now. Now let's jump into the full disc retail games. These are going to be much larger games, usually somewhere between like 6 and 20 gigabytes depending on the game that you're playing, so they have a lot of data to them and they're also prone to crashing a little bit more. For each of these games I had to go through maybe 4 or 5 times and start them up and let it crash until I could actually get into gameplay, and that's because when the shaders are compiling it's just often prone to crashing. I don't know if it's a limitation of the CPU or the RAM, I'm not really sure. The Odin 2 that I have to test with is a 12 gigabyte RAM model, and so it may be that the max models, which have 16 gigabytes of RAM, might do a little bit better, and that might be the bottleneck. But as it stands right now, yes, it takes a lot of attempts to actually get into gameplay for these full disc games. Now, some of these actually run really well once you get them up and running. For example, 3D Dot Game Heroes, which is a game that I had a lot of requests for, actually played pretty well. It does crash from time to time, and it will slow down when you're compiling shaders, but that's kind of par for the course with each of the games that we'll be showing moving forward. Another game I got a lot of requests for that actually played really well was Azura's Wrath. I only played through the first chapter, so that's like the first 10 or 15 minutes of the game, but this one actually did not crash very much at all, and even though yes, it would have some shader compilation stutters, overall I found it to be one of the more playable disc games. And one thing I should note about my testing methodology is that often I will test out a demo of a game before I try the full retail version. There's a couple reasons for that. The first is that often the demos will perform better than the retail release, so I can see immediately if a demo isn't working well, then obviously the retail one will not either. There's also a big file size difference between the two. For example, the Heavenly Sword demo is only about 1.5 gigs compared to the retail game, which is about 18 gigabytes. So this saves me time both in terms of loading up the game and transferring over the files, but then also in shader compilation, because when you're loading up a full retail game like this, it can take upwards of like an hour or two sometimes. And so let's go through a few of these demos that I tried that unfortunately were not really playing at full speed or were causing crashes, which leads me to believe that many of the retail games will not be playable either. For example, with Heavenly Sword, this one plays at about 10 to 15 frames per second, and so it's very stuttery. Even though the gameplay is somewhat fast, it is not something that I would consider to be enjoyable. And bear in mind that I dropped the resolution all the way down to 480p, so it looks quite chunky, and so it's just kind of a degraded performance and experience altogether. One game that held up pretty well is the Folklore demo. Again, this is a very large file. I think it's something like 26 gigabytes, but the demo itself was only a couple. But unfortunately, you can see here that it does have some graphical issues. Now, you might be able to patch and clean these up a little bit more, and if so, then yes, the gameplay might be pretty good. I got an average about 25 to 30 frames per second, which I think is pretty acceptable for a JRPG like this. So this is definitely a game that I think might be worth considering in your testing in the future. Another game demo that shows a lot of promise is Eternal Sonata. This one actually played pretty well when you're in combat and everything. Unfortunately, it would tend to crash from time to time. And unfortunately, the crashing wasn't related to shader compilation. It would just happen randomly. And so I'm a little bit worried that this is one of those games that may not be fully playable. This game is also considered to be not fully playable from the RPCS3 compatibility database as well. So I don't think it really has to do with the Odin 2, but rather just the development of this game. There were also some other game demos that crashed even though they work pretty well on other platforms, including Devil May Cry and Mirror's Edge. Either way, these game demos give me a good idea whether or not it's worth investigating into the retail versions, and so let's jump back over to those now and try out some more. And there were quite a few that were heavily requested that actually played really well, including Tokyo Jungle. This is one that did have some slowdown here and there, but never really passed the point where I would say it was unplayable. I ended up playing about the first half hour of this game and didn't run into any issues, and so if this is one in particular that you are interested in trying out, I think it might be worth testing. I also found that Virtua Fighter 5 Final Showdown worked really well too. In fact, this one had like 0 stutters. It was really, really smooth. Another game that was very close to playing well at native resolution was Wipeout HD. This one would have some stutters here and there, and it didn't seem to be related to shader compilation. Even after running the same track a couple times, it was still getting a bit of bog down. However, it was really impressive how close it got to playable, and so this is one that I would say is just a little bit too slow and stuttery, but very impressive. Another game that was kind of slow but right on the cusp of being playable was BioShock 2. This one I did have to decrease the resolution down to 576p and also a 75% scale. It does make the game look a little bit more fuzzy. It's almost like a decompilation of the original PS3 version. However, the stability here was pretty rock solid. I didn't have any crashes. It was just a little bit slower than I would like. This is one of those games that I hope that with further optimizations it might be fully playable. However, when it comes to some of the other larger games, like Infamous here, even in the very beginning setting, before we get into the open world environment of the city, you can see that it's still running very slowly. I would say on average it's running somewhere between 15 and 20 frames per second, and it'll only get worse after you get through like the 30-minute intro scene as well. However, this is not a big surprise for me because I did not expect open world games like Infamous, one of the most notoriously hard games to play on the PS3, to actually play at full speed on the Odin 2. Now, one game I did expect to run at least pretty well was Little Big Planet, but unfortunately, even dropping down the resolution scale here, it's still a very slow game. And I know this game gets even harder to run as you get further into it and more characters and other things are introduced, and so I don't think this one's going to be fully playable. In addition, I did find this one to be prone to crashing, and so I wasn't able to play it for more than about 10 minutes at a time before I would lose all my progress. One game I was really stoked on trying out was Assassin's Creed. I think it would be really cool to have a portable version of this first game. There are quite a few collections and remastered versions available on the Nintendo Switch, but I really wanted to play this first one, and so I was hoping for something good here. And when playing as Desmond in the closed world environment, it's just fine. I think this actually plays it pretty close to full speed. However, once you get into the open world environment, yeah, everything just kind of falls apart. You're looking at an average about 8 to 10 frames per second, so this is just super slow. So unfortunately, my dreams of being able to play Assassin's Creed on my Odin 2 like this are dashed, at least for now. This is one of those games that might be better to run via Winlator as opposed to PS3 emulation. Another game I would just love to play in handheld mode would be Mass Effect. This is one of my favorite games of all time. I love this on the Xbox 360. And even though the first game did not originally release on the PS3, it did later through the Mass Effect trilogy. However, unfortunately, even when downscaling this down about as far as I'm willing to go, which is going to be a 480p resolution and a 75% scale, it is very close to being playable, but not quite there. Again, this one almost feels like it's on the cusp of being a really good time, so kind of close to BioShock 2 in that regard. Moving on to some games that I don't think are on the cusp at all, these games are just really slow and probably not going to be playable anytime soon. One of those examples would be Dead or Alive 5. This one, even dropped down to a 480p resolution, is only running at about half speed. And as you can imagine, with a fighting game like this, you want to be able to play it at full speed, so this is to me unacceptable. Same thing with Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty. Even dropping this down to a 480p resolution is not enough to get it up to that 30 frames per second speed that we need to get this game to run smoothly. Instead, we're getting around 20 to 25 frames per second, and you can feel all those hiccups and stutters, and so this is not a very enjoyable game, at least for me. Another game I got a lot of requests for is Mobile Suit Gundam Extreme vs. Full Boost. Now, as far as I can tell, this did not have a US release, so I loaded up the Japanese version here, and unfortunately, yeah, it is nowhere close to being up to speed. I think on average I was looking at about 15 to 20 frames per second, and yeah, the game unfortunately just crawled. Even when dropping down the resolution and the scale like I did for other games, did not get anywhere close to being playable, so unfortunately this one is probably out. Another heavily requested game was Tron Evolution, and unfortunately this one does not get past the initial loading screens. I tested this one maybe 10 or 20 times and it would crash at the exact same spot every time, so unfortunately I don't really see this one working. Another game that played really slowly and also was prone to crashing was Skate 3. In fact, I never even got to the retail version of this game because the demo was playing so poorly that I knew it wasn't going to be worth it. And so sadly, yes, this one's playing at about 50% speed and also would crash after a few minutes of gameplay, so I think this one is out as well. Another game I really wanted to try was Blur. This one has been delisted for over 10 years at this point, and so a lot of people want to try this game out, including me. But sadly, even after testing this about 20 times and getting a bunch of crashes, the furthest I could get was the save screen, and it would crash at the end of this. And unfortunately, even the configuration recommendations from the RPCS3 team don't seem to be enough to get this one up and running. So sadly, I don't think this one is playable, at least right now. This is definitely a game that I want to keep on testing in the future because I'm hoping to be able to play it at some point on the Odin 2, but at least right now it does not look very good. And then finally, another game I wanted to test was the 2008 version of Prince of Persia, which is one of my favorites from this console generation. And all signs point to this one actually working, but unfortunately, as soon as you get to the game loading screen, it crashes every single time. And so really that's the extent of my testing. I don't want to draw this out too much, so I just showed some snippets of some of the games and what you can expect. When it comes down to it, PSN titles are definitely worth the time investment because for the most part, as long as they work with the emulator, they work really well on the Odin 2. When it comes to remade versions of like PS2 classic games, I found those to be very hit and miss, and for the most part, you're probably better off just playing the PS2 version on the Android side. And then finally, when it comes to full retail games, I found that there are some hidden gems in there, but it's very hit and miss. Some games like Tokyo Jungle are great, and even something like BioShock 2 is right on the cusp of being there. But for the most part, you'll get a lot of slowdown if you can actually get the game to load into gameplay. So the way I see it, PS3 emulation is still an added bonus on the Odin 2. There might be a game here or there that you can play, but for the most part, I would not recommend buying the Odin 2 specifically to play PS3 games. Instead, I would buy this thing to play all the other systems it's been able to play for years before. The Odin 2 line of devices are still my favorite way to play PS2 and GameCube and even Nintendo Switch games, and so all that stuff is still working on the Android side, but it is still very interesting to see what we can do on the Linux side as well. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. I think it's crazy that we have the ability to play portable PS3 games in the first place. It's not something I ever expected to do, especially because the PS3 CPU was kind of crazy and hard to emulate, and the fact that we can do that on a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 says a lot. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.